domestic deposits in.
Yeah, you're dead on. That's exactly right. The rates on domestic deposits, term deposits, have increased, and Lachlan's right, they didn't pass on the full 45 basis point increase to net savers, that's for sure. But that's again a function of the banks just needing more funding, and they were borrowing from overseas. That's now more expensive. They had the backstop of the government guaranteeing overseas borrowings. They notionally pay for that, but it's a real issue that we've got all this household debt. If you look at mortgage debt to GDP, in 1997 was about 23%. It's now 90%. We've borrowed a lot. Australians have borrowed a lot of money lately, and that money's got to come from somewhere, and it's propping up the residential property prices with this massive amount of debt.
Yeah.
And now the cost of that debt's going up, as it inevitably has to. It's not even historical averages. So I'd expect to see a drop in the value of the price of those assets. So the value is completely different because they've been funded by all this debt and borrowing.
There's a couple of points I make. One, that the government was speculatively thinking of guaranteeing RMBS so as to support
Interference that is obviously has really been unleashed in this last week or fortnight. Now, is that what the banking sector needs, Adam Schwab? I mean, Joe Hockey said last week the banks are out of control. Now, you know, that can just be a loose statement that somebody makes around the kitchen table. But is that a correct statement? Is it a wise statement from the Shadow Treasurer?
I don't know about out of control, but Hockey's point, in a sense, is right. The banks do operate, in many respects, like a cartel. One increases interest rates and suddenly the others will as well. If you've got a really competitive market, people will be dropping rates to try and get market share, and you could argue NAB have done that in the past couple of years, but it's not a very competitive market. There is a degree of price signalling going on. But on the flip side, as we sort of mentioned before, bank margins have actually dropped in the last year. So it's hard to be too critical of an industry when there's margins are dropping. Banks can certainly be criticised for other elements, for that penalty fees, which again they have reduced somewhat in recent years. But yeah, but there still are a lot of penalty fees out there, and they're certainly difficult to stand behind legally on a simple contractual basis. They seem to be unenforceable penalties. So, and obviously there's a big IMF-funded action to try and prove that. But some of Hockey's comments obviously were political posturing and pretty smart politics, because he's obviously making Wayne Swan defend the banks, and that's not a position any politician really wants to be in, defending people who are essentially gouging voters.
Yeah, no, exactly. Lachlan, what do you think about this? Firstly, do you think there's a bit of hypocrisy in all this?
I'm not sure if I 100% agree with your comments, Helen, in terms of the banks got us through the GFC. I think
no, not totally, but what I meant was that there was no talk that they were in any trouble like some of the European and the American banks.
You're right, and that was certainly the consensus, but we did have the government providing an unlimited guarantee for deposits. Which are never creating just a monumental moral hazard. We have the government guaranteeing wholesale funding from overseas. We had Nick Moore from Macquarie Bank on the phone to several ministers getting a short-selling ban imposed. To suggest our banks were some heroes of the GFC. Just to go back as well, the problem with a lot of people have with banks is, well, everybody understands that they're in it to make a profit, but banks are actually incredibly risky institutions. They have about, well, let's use Westpac, 40 billion in equity, 600 billion in assets. They're virtually massive hedge funds, and they use that through obviously a fractional banking system. So we've got these incredibly risky institutions. Banks are inherently insolvent. If everybody wanted their money back at once, a bank goes under, as we saw in the early 30s. So these banks are very risky businesses. They're lending a lot of money to residential housing, for example, and possibly creating a bubble and putting their own solvency at risk for short-term profits. Because obviously mortgage holders at the moment are making good profits for the banks. Now that's great for executive remuneration. So the top dozen executives from each bank make $25 million a year, which is great. But if the bank suddenly goes under in 2 years' time, or what happened in the US, and we're rescuing depositors, don't expect a cent of that money the executives got paid back.
Oh,
that's
absolutely not. No, I know. That won't happen. Exactly the same as happened in the United States, where all those investment bankers got paid huge amounts of money. In fact, they're back paying money to them. And, you know, they were on the public purse.
But it's not even investment. It's actually retail bankers as well, Helen. If you look at Royal Bank of Scotland and some of what happened over in the UK as well. So I've got these bankers, these retail bankers, these supposedly safe, stodgy retail bankers taking what really are surreptitious, massive risks with not only shareholder money, which is fine, but effectively taxpayer money, because taxpayers are guaranteeing deposits. So if Commonwealth Bank, heaven forbid, fell over in 3 years' time, the hundreds of billions, the $377 billion in deposits that they hold, they're going to be funded by the taxpayer. And you won't be getting a cent back from Ralph Norris, who got paid $16 million last year. So that's, I think, the real problem. Banks are the personification of extreme capitalism.
All right,
small amount of equity, massive amount of assets and massive amount of debt.
Okay, so Adam, it now looks definite that we will have some political interference. We will have some legislation. We've either got Joe Hockey's private members bill to give the ACCC more power to look at price signalling and with regard to banks and collusion, or we'll have the government legislation, which the Treasurer has promised next month. But it's interesting. BCA President Graham Bradley told me yesterday in an interview that don't we already have anti-collusion laws in place? He was a bit concerned about, say, this private members bill by Joe Hockey. Now, would you say that's just continuing the protection of banks, or does he have a point?
He does have a point. There are collusion laws, and they virtually, I think Richard Pratt's the only person to ever really be charged with them. I can't see the ACCC cracking down on banks. They haven't cracked down on retail. They haven't cracked down on anyone. They let Bankwest, St George, CBA, Bankwest, St George, Westpac go through. I don't think ACCC were doing anything. What needs to happen and what won't happen is our banks are too big to fail. There's no doubt about that. We need to make, instead of the big four, it should be the 8 pillars. The banks must be able to fail. We need to get rid of this moral hazard that currently exists, that taxpayers are bankrolling banks.
Yeah, isn't this what we went through when Paul Keating announced the 16 new foreign bank licences way back when?
In the 80s,
I mean, that was supposed to really open up the market to competition. Well, it did for a long time, but I guess the G went and announced, extraordinarily strong profits at Westpac this week. I think you mentioned it was something, it was 83% increase in net profits. But she also, on this side of reform and this what's going on in Canberra, she did call for more caution on any more reforms, saying that could lead to unintended consequences. Now, would you say she would say that, wouldn't she? Or again, do you think it is a bit problematic if we start back on this path to more regulation?
You're right. She certainly would say that. And looking at Westpac's profit, that was actually the majority of the profit increase came from lower impairments from its institutional bank. That was virtually all the increase in profit was lower impairments. So take that massive profit improvement with a slight grain of salt. But in terms of Gail's comments, the US is looking at not breaking up, but restricting banks from being proprietary traders and commercial banks. They're almost going back to the sort of Glass-Steagall days, re-separating, re-regulating banking activities. I don't think it'd be a bad thing if we had that here. If our big 4 retail banks weren't able to trade on an investment bank basis, which they currently do. They've all got investment banking arms to varying extents. They've all got very different businesses. I'd much rather them be more simple deposit-taking, basic lending institutions and leave the riskier finance activities to separate entities where the risk can be quarantined and not passed on to taxpayers.
Yeah.
Well, don't we run the risk? Isn't that the integrated model of investment banks, whole service banks, doesn't it sort of give them a bit more muscle and a bit of clout to...
Well, I think that's the point you're making, aren't you, Adam, that in fact it's too much muscle and too much clout if it's all fully integrated.
Exactly, and it's like making Australia a financial hub or these dynamic big banks. The finance sector should exist to allocate capital efficiently. Everything else is just generating more money for the executives that work in those banks, and that's not really benefiting. Certainly benefits them, and good on them, but it doesn't really benefit the economy or the community as such. So, if you look at the US experience, it has shown us that the Citigroup supermarket-style bank, Citigroup would have collapsed like Lehman Brothers had the US not guaranteed $300 billion of its debt in late 2008. The big dynamic supermarket model of banks isn't a good one. It's a risky one. It may generate great profits in the short term. It may be able to pay executives $20 million a year and give good short-term returns to shareholders, but it's certainly not in the long-term interests of an economy when the taxpayers are then backing up these massive risk-taking institutions.
Exactly, too big to fail. All right, we are going to take